Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending upon which part of the world you are in. Firstly, I want to thank you all for joining this webinar, and I hope that you will find it useful. So, as you can see, that the focus of this webinar is going to be on how to conduct a literature review. More specifically, we'll start with what is a literature review and why we even do literature reviews. So that discussion is important so that we can contextualize the rest of the webinar. Some of you, I assume that they may not have so much idea about literature reviews and why literature reviews are conducted. So for their benefit, we'll first start with the introduction. Then we'll focus on why we do literature reviews, and then major chunk of the webinar that will go into that how do we conduct our literature review, and lastly, what are the different kinds of tools that we can use for conducting literature reviews. And also at the end, we will have around 15 minutes where I'll take questions and I'll try to answer as many questions as possible. Who am I? So I'm Fahim Ullah, and I am an assistant professor and program director at the University of Adelaide in Australia. Now, a bit about my background related to literature reviews. So I conducted several literature reviews. I published them in decent venues. Some of them I did as lead author, some of them I did as co-author. But I, at least in my view, believe that I have some bit of idea of what literature reviews are and how they are conducted. So I did literature reviews during my PhD. Also, I did literature review during my postdoc. And even as an academic, I work with several researchers where we do literature reviews. So basically in this webinar, I'll share my own understanding and my own strategies that has helped me, and I hope that it would also help you in conducting literature reviews. So the first question that we need to start with is that what is a literature review? Now, literature reviews are carried out in different stages of your educational or academic career. When you're doing bachelor's, there is also a part where you might do literature review. In your master's, you might also do literature review. In your PhD, you certainly have to do your postdoc also, and also in your academic career. Depending upon which stage you are, it may differ, because for at bachelor's level or at master's level, the literature review might be a bit shallow, but at PhD level, you are expected to do a more comprehensive and solid literature reviews. So what we'll discuss today is a more broader approach towards literature review, and I hope that it would be applicable to every stage, irrespective of whether you are a PhD student, whether you are a postdoc, or you are a bachelor or master's student. So when you start a research project, the first question that you are asked is that what research you want to do, right? So what exactly is the punchline of your research? For example, some people say, okay, I want to see the impact of this thing on this particular thing and want to find out that how it affects X affects Y and so on. Now, after that, you answer the question why you want to do this research. So that comes as part of the motivation. That is it important? Is it significant? Who will benefit from the research that you're doing, and in what ways they will benefit from the research you are doing? Okay, so this part is also very important, because we obviously want to do research that is important and that is of benefit to others. And thirdly, the question is that how exactly you're going to do that research. So this comes as the methodology part, that, okay, you want to do this research, and it is also important to do this research, but how exactly you're going to conduct this research. And the fourth question is that what has already been done. So you need to position the novelty of your research with respect to existing research. You do not want to reinvent the wheel. You want to do something new. And at the same time, uh, for instance, if you are a PhD student, so as an evaluator, we want to make sure that you have a decent understanding of the existing literature. You know your field, and then based on that, you have picked up this particular gap that, okay, I want to fill this gap during my PhD, and this is how it positions with respect to the existing research. So this is where literature review comes into play, that what has already been done. In order to answer this question, you have to do a literature review. Now, you might do it only for the purpose of understanding the field. You might do literature review in order to put that review in your thesis. And you might also, if the review is done in a good, solid way, then you might go and you might want to publish that literature review. So the focus of this webinar is this question: what has already been done in your field of study? If we look at this funnel, so what happens is that, now one thing I want to clarify, because that is the terminology I will use throughout this webinar. So there are primary studies and then there are secondary studies. When I say primary study, that means that somebody has done an experiment or they have collected real world data and then they have analyzed and then they have produced some findings. Okay, so that's the primary study. When I say secondary study, by that I mean literature reviews, which means that a researcher has collected, let's say 70, 80 papers, 70, 80 primary research studies, and then they have analyzed and studied that and produced some output based on the study of those primary research studies. Now, if we look at this one, so what goes in is the research studies. So for example, if you want to do a literature review on a topic like machine learning for cybersecurity, so what you will do is that you will collect some relevant papers, say 70, 80 papers. Then you will compile those studies. You will summarize the findings. You will analyze the contributions of those 70 papers. You will identify a gap. You will highlight inconsistencies, and then you will produce foundation for future research in that particular field. So this is a broader kind of flow of how literature review works. We take the primary studies and then we analyze, study those primary studies and produce kind of a foundation for future research. Now, when I say that we identify 70 or 80, this is a rough number I'm picking. The number can be as small as 30 papers, or it could be as high as 300 papers. Where do we find these papers, these primary studies? So we find these papers from these digital databases. For example, you can see we can find papers on Google Scholar, on Scopus, or on Archive. Depending upon which field you are in, it might vary. Some, like for example, for medical databases, PubMed is a more popular. For computer science students or for IT students, IEEE or ACM is very popular database. So these are some of the databases from which we can collect papers. Now, how much effort it requires to conduct a solid literature review? In my understanding, when I did literature reviews back in my PhD, it took around 3 to 5 months. But again, these were very kind of high quality literature reviews in terms of that they were published in good venues later on. But this effort might vary. This is what is my experience. But generally, it takes quite a decent amount of time to conduct a literature review. In fact, it takes more time to conduct a literature review as compared to a primary study. Now, in this webinar, we'll focus on how we can reduce this time, how we can do research that is of high quality, but at the same time, we do it efficiently and in little bit of comparatively less amount of time. Now, before we move on, it is important to sort of mention that there are different types of literature reviews. For example, there are narrative review, there are systematic literature review, there are critical reviews, and so on and so forth. So each of them have their own methodology, concrete methodology of how you can conduct a specific type of literature review. Now, what we'll study in or we'll focus on in this webinar is a more generic methodology that you can apply in conducting literature reviews. Of course, if you want to go specific into a particular type, then you need to sort of do the customization of the methodology according to that type of literature review. Generally, when we talk about the structure of a literature review, there are three parts. The first one is introduction. In this part, you have to mention that what is the topic of the literature review, and then more so you need to mention that why it is important to conduct this literature review. So you have to motivate the need for this review. The second part is main body. So in this part, you have to bring the meat of your study, which means that all the patterns, the insights, the different kind of consistencies or inconsistencies you find in the body of literature, you have to mention it in the main body. And lastly, conclusion. So here you need to sort of draw the map for future research in that field. I personally, when I'm reading a literature review, I mainly focus on the conclusion part or on the discussion part where I can see that, okay, these researchers have studied, let's suppose, these 70, 80 papers in this field. What are their key findings? Where we can build further research on the top of the existing research. So I'm personally very much interested to read the discussion and the conclusion section of the literature review. Now, when we look at it from the research paper perspective, that what literature review looks like when we publish it. So it has these different parts. It starts with an introduction. Then we have the background and related work. Now, it's important to note that in the related work section, we mention other literature reviews that are relevant to our literature review. And at that time, we try to position the novelty of our literature review, that how our literature review is new compared to existing literature reviews in that field of study. The next one is research methodology. So in this part, we describe how we have conducted this literature review so that the reviewers, they have confidence that this study is conducted in the right way. And then we go and we have the results. In the results section, as I mentioned, that we present the sort of classifications, the trends, the patterns, the insights from that field of study. Next, we have implications for researchers. So this is, again, a very important part of a literature review, that we identify gaps, that, okay, where are the gaps in this particular field of study that future researchers can fill. Next, we have implications for practitioners. So in any field, like, for example, if we take the field of, let's suppose, artificial intelligence, so there are findings that are relevant for researchers, and then there are findings that are relevant to practitioners. For example, there is a certain, let's suppose, security vulnerability that is common among many applications, AI applications, and that the practitioners need to be aware of. Next, we mention the limitations, which means that how certain aspects can threaten the validity of these findings. For example, in limitations, we can mention, or often it is mentioned, that it is possible that we might have missed a relevant primary study from this literature review. And then we conclude the literature review. As far as this webinar is concerned, so this is going to be our focus, which is research methodology. As I mentioned, that in order to focus on this part, we need to understand how, what exactly literature review is, and only then we can go and we can talk about that, how to conduct a proper literature review. Now, the main part of this in this webinar, how to conduct a literature review. So these are the main steps. For example, we first need to identify the need for review, then go and define the research questions, then conduct a pilot study, design search string, define inclusion, exclusion criteria, select relevant studies, extract data, analyze, and report data. So in the next 10-15 minutes, I will go and I'll talk about each of these steps, that how we can work on each of these steps within the methodology of literature review. So the first one is specify the need for the review. As I mentioned, that it is important that you have a solid motivation for conducting a literature review. Now, the purpose of literature review, it could be different. For example, for someone, it could be establishing a foundation for your own research. The next could be identifying gaps. Now, identifying gaps is one of the main reasons why many PhD students conduct literature reviews. So they understand a field of study, and then they go and they conduct literature review in that field to identify gaps. The third one is understanding trends. So as I mentioned that, for example, if you are doing a literature review in the field of artificial intelligence, or say AI algorithms, so you can go and you can, for instance, conduct a literature review to see the trends, that whether people use more, so for example, supervised learning, or they use unsupervised learning algorithms. The next one is validating findings. So if you have findings, you can do a literature review to kind of compare whether the other literature, existing literature, they support or they contradict those findings. And lastly, about guiding direction. So if you are starting a big project and you want to first understand the field of that field and then guide your research accordingly, so you can also conduct a literature review. From the reviewer perspective, it is important that you have a solid reason and you have justification for that if you want to do literature review and then you want to publish it. Step 2 is defining the research questions. Now, this is one of the, I would say, the toughest part, because it's very important that you define the right set of questions. If your questions are not good enough, sort of the rest of the effort would go in vain. So, and also for, especially for early career researchers, defining right set of questions, it's quite challenging. So for this purpose, what you have to do is that you need to properly collaborate with your supervisor or with your PhD advisor. Then you need to outline broader research topics. So you need to, in discussions, you have to first kind of narrow down that, okay, what topic you want to conduct a literature review on. Then you need to define initial research questions. Okay, then you need to go and more specific, become more specific. Then you need to scope your literature review. Now, it's again very important. I'll tell you, I have submitted literature reviews, and many times it happened to me that I get the comments that the scope of this literature review is not clear. Scope means that what is covered and what is not covered in this literature review. So you need to be careful about the scope and its clarification. And then you need to ensure that your questions are clear and targeted. For example, these are a couple of questions from one of my literature reviews that was published, I think, 2-3 years ago. So this is what research questions for a literature review look like in my field. It might be different in your field. Step 3 is conduct a pilot study. Now, what is pilot study? Pilot study is that you do a study, but on a small scale. You don't go full scale. And you do it on a small scale to make sure that you are going in the right direction. So what happens is that in a pilot study, you try to identify 8 to 10 papers relevant to that field that you know basically that, yeah, these are very relevant to the topic. You assess the relevance, like as I mentioned, that you already know, and then you see that whether these papers are relevant to your research questions or not. If they are relevant and you can properly answer the questions, then that's fine, you can go ahead. If not, then you need to redefine your research questions. Step 4 is designing the search string. Now, this is more relevant in the context of literature reviews, like systematic literature reviews, where you are supposed to make sure that you do not miss any relevant paper. So you design a search string, like the one that is shown here is an example, and you run it through the databases that I mentioned, like for example, Scopus or Google Scholar or IEEE Explore. Then you see that whether the results are satisfactory or not, whether you are getting the papers that you already know that they are relevant. For example, as I mentioned that in pilot study, you already know that, okay, these 8 to 10 papers are relevant. Then if the search string is returning those papers, it means that your search string is correct. If it is not returning those papers, then you need to adjust your search string. Step 5 is define inclusion and exclusion criteria. Again, this part is important because you need to be clear that what is going to be part of your review and what is not going to be part of your review. In other terms, which papers are going to become the part of your literature review and which are not going to become part of your literature review. So, because what happens is that when you hit the search string, you get a very huge number of papers returned, right? Like, for example, when I executed this search string shown in the previous slide, it returned around 4,500 papers. Now, it's not possible to include 4,500 papers. That would take me maybe 3 years to read all those papers. So we have to define a criteria that what is going to become part of our paper and which papers are not going to be part of our paper. For example, you can define that, okay, a paper that has only given some ideas, but they have not experimentally evaluated their ideas or proposed solution, they are not going to become part of my paper. Similarly, you can define the quality metric that a paper that is, for example, published in A-rank journals or a high impact journals, only those papers are going to become part of my review. So you need to sort of define this criteria, and that would help you to narrow down the number of papers to be part of your literature review. Step 6 is selecting relevant studies. Now you have run the search string through the digital database. Then you have these papers returned, let's suppose 4,500 papers. You have to find the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Now you have to pass all these 4,500 papers through that criteria to sort of end up with a small number but relevant studies for your literature review. So the steps are, for example, you run an automatic search that return papers, then you select studies based on titles, okay, because it's easy to read the title of a paper. Then you remove duplicates. What I mean by duplicates is that if you are running the search string on multiple databases, as you can see in this example that I ran the search string on 6 different databases, like IEEE Explore, Scopus, Science Direct, and so on. Then you need to select, once you do that step, you remove the duplicates. Then, like, for example, as you see, the initial search returned 4,634 papers. Then when I did title-based selection, so it came down to 748 papers. Then I removed duplicates, so it came down to 516 papers. Then I read the abstract of those 516 papers, so the number came down to 168 papers. Then I read the full text of those papers, and the number further came down to 69 papers. And then I did snowballing, which is a step that I went through the references of these 69 papers. And then from those references, I picked 5 more papers that I also felt that these are relevant. So my final pool of papers was 74 papers. And this kind of comprehensive process of selection, it ensures that you do not miss any relevant paper. Step number 7, which is extraction of data from the papers. So I have collected these 74 papers, and now I need to extract relevant data against my research questions from these papers. So how this process works, you have the papers. The most important thing here is to design a data extraction form so that you can be clear in your head that what exactly I'm going to extract from these papers. Like in my case, what I did was that I collected the metadata, which is like the author, year, title, and so on. But most importantly, I collected like the items, for example, the big data processing framework, proposed technique, quality attributes, because these were the ones that were directly relevant to my research questions. So like nowadays, there are far better tools to use. At that time, when I did this review, I used to extract data and put it in an Excel sheet. Now, the last part is analyze and report data. What does this mean? It means that you have extracted the data. Now you need to understand and analyze the data to understand patterns, trends, and extract insights from the data. You also need to sort of, when you're analyzing, you need to look for research gaps, you need to look for new questions, you need to look for methodological improvements, that how those kind of, let's suppose in a specific field, how these studies can be conducted in a better way. How you can do that? For analysis of the data, there are again different methods. Like, for example, thematic analysis, statistical methods, qualitative analysis, and so on. Like in my case, at that time, what I used was thematic analysis. And when using these methods, you need to look for implications. Now, one particular thing I would suggest you is that when I used to extract data, at that very time, I used to think about this particular aspect that, for example, if there's an insight, what would be the implications of this insight for researchers? What would be the insight of these implications for practitioners? If you leave it at the end, it becomes very difficult to sort of come up with solid implications. So when you are analyzing, extracting the data and analyzing, try to note down that, okay, for example, this is a good point, this is a good insight that can become a point for directing future research in this field. Okay, so now we take 5 seconds pause because we have finished the first part, which was about how to do literature review. Now, the second part is going to be focused on the different tools that we can use throughout this whole process to help us do this literature review efficiently. Okay. So what are the different tools that we can use for literature review? Now, before going into the details, uh, obviously you would come across many tools these days that are there in the market and that can help you in many different ways to do research more efficiently. So for the purpose of literature review, what tools are relevant that I mentioned here? So if we look at the first step, that is about searching papers. So I'm sure that you would have heard about lit maps. That's a very good tool that can help you to identify relevant papers for your literature review. The second one is monitoring new papers. Now, when you are doing literature review, it's important not to miss papers, and it's more important not to miss any new papers, recent studies. So for that purpose, this tool helps you to sort of, it sends you alerts that, okay, there is a new study that is published in your niche area. The third step is summarizing papers. So obviously in the first go, you cannot read all the papers, the full text of all the papers. So for that purpose, Enego Read is a very good tool. It's spelled incorrectly here. It is ENGAGO. Then for paper reading, again, Enego Read is a very good tool because it helps you to sort of, within this tool, when you read the paper, you can note down the points. You can, when you are extracting the data, you can put the extracted data there, and you can also put your own notes within that. Then critical analysis of papers also Enego Read can help you in that, because what it does is that it can help you to do comparative analysis of different papers as well. And number 6 is correlation of papers. So let's suppose you have 70 papers in a literature review. You also need to compare the outcomes of those papers, whether they are against each other, whether they are supporting each other. So lit maps, it draws a kind of map for you that you can use to see how these papers are correlated with each other. Number 7 is creating the first draft. So paper poll, when you have the data extracted and you have the analysis done, then in that case, this tool, paper poll, it can help you to create the first draft of your literature review. Then in order to refine the first draft or compare the draft done by a paper poll with a more automated draft, you can use research poll. Then the next one, step 9, is finding references. So once you have the draft, you want to motivate the different sections or support or contradict certain arguments in your literature review. In that case, you can use paper poll to help you identify relevant references. Once that part is done, you can move towards part 10, which is paraphrase text. In this one, you can use string AI. What it does is that often when we write the first draft, it's a bit rough. the grammar is not smooth, there are typo errors and so on and so forth. So this one, it can help you to smoothen your writing. Number 11, journal selection. So if you have a plan that you want to do a literature review and then you want to publish it, in that case, you are more likely to send it to a journal. Now, which journal to send it to? You can use a paper poll to help you select the right journal based on the abstract of your literature review. Once you have selected the journal, step 12 would be to proofread your paper. So you can look for all kinds of errors, inconsistencies, biases, and so on and so forth in your paper, and you can use Trinka AI for that purpose. Step 13 would be checking the citations. Now, you have done all and you want to see the quality of citations in your paper. How good are the papers in your, the references in your paper? So for that purpose, you can use Trinka AI, and that will evaluate all the references in your paper, that whether they are of good quality, whether they are of not good quality, whether they are recent, whether they are not recent, and so on. Step 14, review based on questions. Now, when you have done all of these parts, then you can see the quality of your entire literature review. So you can ask questions from paper poll that to assess your writing. Is it good? Is it not good? Where you can improve your writing, where you can improve different parts of your literature review. So for that purpose, you can use paper poll. And lastly, step 15, when all of this is done, and if you want to, before you going to submit the journal, if you want to have an internal review of your paper, similar to a human would do, in that case, you can use Review My Paper, which is a tool that reviews your paper similar to a human would do. And it gives you kind of, okay, what are the strengths of your paper? What are the weaknesses in your paper? And so on and so forth. So this is a summary. And now we'll go and I'll show you how each of this step works. So this is the first one for lit maps, that how we can use this tool to search relevant papers. So let's have a look at this demo. So you put the search term. It has returned the papers, and now you are selecting that, okay, based on title, these are the relevant papers. So it has created that map for you guys. Now you are refining your search terms or your search process so that you can get more concretely relevant papers. You can apply different kind of filters, like you can restrict it based on year or based on the quality of the papers. So you have made a library of the papers that are relevant. And this is how this particular tool, it can be more effective in terms of identifying the right set of papers for your literature review. Now, when we look at this one, this is about monitoring new papers so that you want to make sure that no paper go missing under your radar. Now you have entered a search term. And you're just selecting the papers that, okay, these are relevant papers. Then you, similar to that, you explore more relevant papers. Now you see how these papers are relevant to each other. And here is the important part. You see enable monitor. So it has enabled that what kind of alerts you would get. So you have entered the search term, then you have picked up the relevant papers. And based on that, it will send you alerts that, okay, a new paper has published in your research area. Now, this is Inigo Read that I mentioned, that once you select the relevant papers, then you also receive alerts about relevant papers. After that, you can use this tool to get customizable summaries. So you can get a summary of the whole paper, or if you want to summarize a particular part of the paper or section of the paper, for example, you want to summarize only the result section so that you understand particular pieces of data in that paper. So for that purpose, you can use this tool called Inigo Read. So you see, you open a paper in that, and then you ask it to generate a summary for you. The next one is about reading papers. So while there are many other tools for reading papers, this one is one of the best because it helps you to take notes. It helps you to sort of compare the papers and so on and so forth. So let's have a look at how you can use Enego Read to read papers more effectively for your literature review. So here you see that you are reading a paper and then you are also kind of, it is directly connected to the web. So through Enego Read, you can see that whether there are other papers that has addressed the same research questions, or if there is more relevant literature to this paper, and then you can directly add those literature to your library in Enego Read, and you can also read those relevant papers. Now, as I mentioned that until this far, you are more in the process of selecting the relevant papers. But now once you have selected the relevant papers, next we have to move on to analyze the data from those papers. Now, Enego Read, it also enables you to critically analyze papers. And how it does that, let's have a look at this quick demo. So as you can see that you have opened the paper and there is critique, and within critique there are certain questions that you have put in, and you are putting answers to those questions as you are reading the paper. So in a way, when you read a paper through Enego Read, you would end up with very solid notes of your own that would enable you to have a critical view of the paper. Part 6 was about correlation of papers. So through lit maps, you can do very excellent correlation of papers. So if you look at this particular screenshot, you can see that among the lot of papers that you have identified, which papers are the most new, right? So that you can see from on the right side, and which are the papers that are of the highest quality. As you can see that as we go from top to bottom, the number of citations of these papers increases. Like for example, Thompson 2004 is the most highly cited paper in our pool of papers. Step number 7, and that is about creating the first draft. Now you have collected data, be that in an Excel sheet or be that in an Enego Read, and now you want to sort of write a first draft based on that information. So you can use Paperfall for that purpose. How it works, let's have a look at this quick demo. So you have this data in an Excel sheet. You go to Paperfall online. So you have uploaded the notes that you had. And it creates the first draft. Now it is important to note that this is not the final draft. This is just a starting point. Now, what you can do is that is based on your notes. Now let's go and have a look at a draft of a review based on the research questions that you have. So for that purpose, you can use Research Poll. You can select your field and then what kind of review you want, short or long, and then you can enter your question. Here, so this is an additional step, and the very reason for this step is that you can make a comparison that, for instance, an automated review and a review that is based on your notes, how do they compare, whether they look alike or not, whether you have missed a study, for example, that is mentioned by this automated tool or not. So it would, in a way, give you confidence in your literature review. Now, step 9 is that once you have the draft, then you want to sort of support or kind of challenge some arguments. So for that purpose, you can find relevant references that other tools Like for example, ChatGPT will not be able to find for you like real references. So how this feature works, so I have entered a keyword, and then it has given me different kind of references for supporting or for challenging certain arguments related to my paper. And then you can choose the citation style based on the field you're in, because different fields use different types of citation styles. Part 10 is that, okay, you have the draft, you have compared the draft, you have put references in the draft, then of course it is rough. So for then you can do paraphrasing so that your text becomes more smooth. For that purpose, you can use this tool Trinka AI, and how it works, let's see. So you have a piece of text, and then there is the option of paraphrase. And then you can pick that how much changes you want, a low degree of changes, a high degree of changes. You can select whether you want to see the revisions, whether you don't want to see the revisions. And when you are satisfied with the output, then you can choose to replace the output with the paraphrased output. Next, we have inline the journal selection. So when you are having the literature review, when you're done with the literature review, and as I mentioned, that if it is of a high quality and you plan to submit it to a journal, so you have to pick a right journal. Now, how the journal can be picked, there are many different ways. Often at times research labs have some fixed venues where they submit. Sometimes people select based on the quality, like, okay, it should be A star or it should be of a certain impact factor. If those limitations are not there for you, in that case, you can simply put your abstract here in PaperPal, and then PaperPal will suggest you based on your abstract that which is the most relevant journal for this kind of study. So you can also do filtering based on the site score, H-index, impact factor, and so on and so forth. Next is proofreading your paper. So there are many different kind of issues that can happen in the paper. For example, formatting issues, there are grammar issues, there are typo issues, there are inconsistencies. To remove all of those issues in your paper, what you can do is that you can use the proofread feature of Trinka AI, and that will help remove all those such issues from your manuscript. How this works, let's have a look. So in order to proofread your file, you first go to Trinka.ai, then you go. So you have to upload your manuscript, and then you say start proofreading. So these are the issues that it has identified. For example, there are preposition issues, singular, plural, noun kind of issues. And then you can download those changes. So here you see it has changed the manuscript so that it can make it smooth and remove formatting or grammar and those kind of issues from your manuscript. Next is checking the citations or the quality of citations in your paper. So for that purpose, you can use the check citations feature of Trinka AI. Let's have a look how this feature works. So again, you have to upload your manuscript. So it says that 36 out of the 54 references are at risk. So some are retracted, poorly cited, journal bias, and so on and so forth. High risk, medium risk, low risk. So it gives you a report of the quality of the references that you have in your paper. And obviously, if you agree with the output of these, in that case, you can work on, for example, the poorly cited ones or the ones that are not of high quality. Maybe you can replace them with better citations. Step 14 was about reviewing your paper based on some questions. So for example, you can ask question like, okay, assess the quality of my writing. Is it good? Is it not good? For that purpose, you can use paper poll. Let's have a look how it works. So you have the text and you go to checks and you say suggest writing feedback. So it gives you a kind of a review of your writing, that how your writing is, where there are some mistakes, where you can make improvement. You can ask also more customized question. And once it gives you the output or the feedback, then you can have a look at the feedback. If you agree with parts of the feedback, then you can act on it and you can accordingly improve your manuscript. And the last part is about reviewing your paper like a human. So for this purpose, there is this tool called Review My Paper. Here you also have to upload your manuscript, and it gives you that, okay, what are the strengths of your paper? What are the weaknesses of your paper? And it gives you overall score of the paper. Like, for example, how each of the section can be scored and how the overall paper can be scored. So let's have a look how this works. So you see this has given an 8.13 out of 10 for this paper. It has identified strengths in each section of the paper, and then it has identified weaknesses in each section of the paper. So if you agree with the outcome in that case, or the feedback in that case, you can work on it. Now, these are the links for the tools that I mentioned, in the last 10 or so slides, that different features of these tools can be used to do or to conduct a literature review more efficiently. Now, in this presentation, I first mentioned the different steps that how to do a literature review. And then in the second portion, I mentioned that, okay, what are the different tools that we can use to for various purposes within the literature review process. Now, it's important that we have certain points in mind when using these tools. The first one is that these tools they are not supposed to replace you as a researcher. You have to learn, you have to put all that hard work in doing research. The second thing is that you need to be aware of biases and limitations. Now, these tools, they are not human beings. They are tools. The output can be biased. It could have some limitations. So you need to be careful about that. The third one is you do not need to trust these tools blindly. As I mentioned, that these tools are trained on some data. They are there to help you. But at the end of the day, they have some limitations, and you need to just double check the output of these tools. Number 4 point is that use it to get ideas, but actively review the output and read it in your own words. Now, this is important. When the tool gives you an output, you as a human being are in the best position to sort of assess is it good, is it not good? And also, you do not need to copy and paste. That's not the purpose of these tools. None of them. The purpose is to guide you, to kind of help you in doing research. Number 5 is preserve academic integrity. Now, this is very important. When you're doing research, it's very important that you follow the guidelines of the journals. You follow the guidelines of the institutions you are associated with, because research, it's a very kind of noble profession, and the aim is to learn and also to generate findings for the benefit of the field and overall society. Number 6 is you need to be aware of plagiarism. because if you directly copy and paste the outcomes of these tools, in that case, that could be flagged as plagiarism. Number 7 is the protection of sensitive information. When you are uploading information, you need to sort of be careful. You can read their policies, that what sort of measures they have taken in order to protect that your information, in order to ensure that your information is protected. And lastly, you need to keep up to date about the use of AI tools, because the journals or the institutions, the academic bodies, their regulations, their guidelines about AI tools keep on changing. So you need to keep yourself up to date about those regulations.